Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. And now we continue our coverage of Vladimir Putin, the Russian Prime Minister, who has faced a marathon grilling by the public. It was his 10th televised phone-in, and Putin was, once again, on combative form. In more than 4.5 hours of fielding questions, we have heard a little bit of everything. Comments on the recent rallies, rejection of a ballot rerun, and a suggestion of condom-like protest ribbons. Praise for the man who may become Putin's main challenger in the March 4th presidential vote, and what has become a frequent criticism of Western meddling in Russia's affairs. Indeed, even a bold claim that a US drone killed Libya's leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. But was he the cool, calm and collected strongman to whom we have grown accustomed, or has he been rattled by the protests and his own flagging popularity? And what signs are we seeing of the much-anticipated Putin Mark II? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Jana Kobzova, a Fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Pirt, a Central Asia expert. And over the phone from Moscow by the political analyst Dmitry Andreev. To you, first of all, Dmitry, how did you rate Putin's performance?
So, I think that today Putin was much more cutting and sarcastic than he usually was during his previous public communications. That is quite reasonable because of the former Saturday's demonstrations. He had to demonstrate his force and absolute confidence in himself. Certainly, the most sharp moments of Putin's speech were his words concerning the participation in the meetings, which, as he mentioned, was paid from the pocket of the so-called and non-identified dark forces. Also, I may remind his remark that the famous ballot paper from the front page of the Russian journal Power was thrown in the ballot box in London, where now the several Putin's hostile political opponents live, such as Berezovsky and some others. Or we may remember Putin's hints of the white stripes on the breasts of the participants of the oppositional meetings and so on. Certainly, I understand that he mentioned that the mentioned episodes were the most lucky, the most tasteful from the Putin's monologues. But otherwise, I would like to point out that there were at least two subjects more interesting than Prime Minister's jokes and caustic remarks on the border of acceptable or even unprintable. The first subject was the demonstrative moving away from President Medvedev. And today I heard rumor that may sign the soon resignation of President, and the situation of the 12 years ago when Putin came into power will be repeated. And the second subject is the specific fact that there are real two Russias now in present-day Russia. The Russia of Putin's majority and the Russia of the minority hostile to Putin.
Jana, what did you think of the showmanship?
I found it quite puzzling because I was thinking if this was the beginning of Putin's presidential campaign, I wonder what the message was. It wasn't quite clear. Clearly, as you said before, he was trying to project an image of a strongman who is jovial, joking, promising the usual stuff, stability, order, and so on. But I wonder what new there was, and I think that was one of the things that many Russians expected from this televised debate. What is his response to the demonstrations? What is his response to the sort of the sense of tiredness with him among the Russian population? And none of that really came out, really.
Do you agree, Asher?
Well, it was very interesting, actually, because it did seem to be a classic Putin speech. I mean, all the questions were similar to anything we've heard before, very much the same sort of linguistic language, where you see that Putin talks about the law, everything must be done within the law, and it's so repetitive that there's not really anything new. But between the lines, and he did say a few interesting things, but we can move on to those later on, perhaps.
Let's move on to one of them. In terms of news, he ruled out a rerun of the parliamentary election that many in Russia claim was rigged and non-competitive. Asher, carry on. Was that a surprise for you?
Well, not really, but this is quite dangerous, really, because if these protests in Moscow and across Russia, because of course we are aware of the protests in St. Petersburg and also in Moscow, but really these rallies went on throughout Russia. So we do have to think really that there are so many kind of strange complaints and that do need to be followed up. So the fact that Putin, without even really listening to the CEC, what they have to say, he's decided, well, no rerun. And that's something that we've got to really think about, really. So,
Dmitry, were you surprised by that?
I think that now we saw a little bit new Putin because his predominant role seems to be quite old. As my colleague has already mentioned, his linguistic features were from the previous period of his presidency. And I think that nowadays his main agenda is to find out the new points of the interpretations of the present-day situation in Russia.
It's very interesting, actually, the demand. There was something in the Q&A that we did spot, that there was almost a demand for all voters to actually come out and vote for the presidential candidate of his choosing, really. In other words, Vladimir Putin. So I think that's what he did see, actually, and anyone observing or at least looking at the election results realised that the turnout was incredibly low. So he needs to actually get out there and get people voting. The danger is they might not want to vote for him.
Jana, you said that you felt the performance was, I suppose, a little stale. We have seen some reaction from the public already, Twitter postings. I've seen quite a few that are derogatory, sarcastic about, the length of time that Putin was speaking for. Does this and the protests show that the Putin magic isn't working anymore?
I think it's definitely working for less people than Putin hoped for. That doesn't mean that he has no support. He still has lots of support. But I think what this has shown, the whole performance today was based on Putin that you saw 10 or 8 years ago or 4 years ago. Nothing new in terms of new ideas. How to solve the situation of the protests. What is the real response to the demands that people had on the squares? The sort of the usual mix of quite an aggressive defense, I must say, mocking the protesters the way he did, using the US as the sort of the convenient, the external enemy, and so on. All these things have been there before, talking about luxury tax to please the people in the villages and so on. These are the things that he's used so many times. And I just wonder how long this can go on. And I was quite surprised to see that they haven't really tried harder to come up with something that would at least partly respond to the demands that there have been voiced for past 2 weeks.
We've started talking about next year's presidential elections, this perhaps being the start of the race in some ways. I personally was watching out for what Putin would say about the candidacy of Mikhail Prokhorov. This is what he said. He described him as a worthy, strong competitor to run against next year. How do you interpret that, Dmitry?
So I'm sure that Prokhorov was the Kremlin project during the several years of the previous history of Russia. He was the Kremlin, the real Kremlin project 5 years ago, 3 years ago. And I am sure that he was the Kremlin project even last autumn when he tried to make his own political party. And I think that he will not be the independent candidate. Certainly he wants to be the independent. Certainly he wants to play his own political role in Russian future. But he has the very heavy heritage, which will be the obstacle on his way to the large politics, I'm sure.
The point Dmitry is raising there is what critics say about Prokhorov's candidacy, that it's a ruse to present Russia as a multi-party democracy. Is there anything we saw from Putin today which sheds light on that?
Well, it is fascinating, actually, really, the idea that he's now put in a rival to actually, go against him and he can have the TV debates with, but at the same time always, well, I'm going to win, you're not. But what would be fascinating, actually, if the Russian people actually do want to actually vote for this oligarch.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, obviously, as Dmitry said before, he's not perceived as entirely independent.
No.
But if you look at the other scope of presidential candidates, you know, the usual faces of Zhirinovsky and Mironov and Zyuganov and others, he is the new face. And Pravaya Dela had some support before. And I mean, I'm not sure to what extent they can control him now. And the real question for the presidential elections next year is, where is the anger of the people going to be channeled? You know, is that not going to be channeled? I mean, are they going to vote for someone else, or are they not going to turn out or protest? And he is one that can actually capture part of that protest vote.
Yeah, it's very true, actually. I mean, one of the things that I've been discussing with people is that the presidential race could well go to a second round, where it's not going to be a done deal, and it'd be a fascinating race, actually. And also, I mean, we remember previous elections with Yeltsin, for instance, about how the communists came back in, really. Well, almost were right on the barrel. And so there'll be a lot of interesting developments, really. Whether Russia would do a Moldova and bring the communists in. I mean, I did find it interesting, actually, looking at the kind of the electoral results across Russia and just seeing how well Zyuganov the Communist Party did, in the sense that they managed to get all of their core supporters out, whereas United Russia, where is their core support voting? And that's what Putin seemed to come out with in this Q&A. He was like, please come out. Please come out, otherwise I'm not going to get elected.
Dmitry, another one of the things that I was looking out for was the way that Putin would describe all the people that took to the streets in protest, many of them directly against him. One of the things he said is that he was pleased to see these young people on the streets because it showcased freedom and democracy in modern-day Russia. What did you make of that?
I think that situation will be quite clear in 2 weeks after the next meeting on the December 24th. But I think that future meeting will not be so massive and so remarkable because it will be on the eve of the New Year holidays.
I mean, I'm not so sure about that, actually. I mean, if they can really go to town with all the social media, because what was interesting, actually, on Saturday was just watching all Twitter feeds and Facebook and you know, the equivalent to Facebook in Russia, and the Live Journal, for instance, that there was just so much, you know, come out. And we're not just talking about in Moscow, we're just talking about the whole of Russia, really. I mean, you know, it was such a significant event. It was one of the biggest turnouts since probably the fall of the Soviet, probably about 1993.
One of the other comments Putin made about the protesters, he described the white ribbons that they were wearing, and he said that he thought they looked like condoms, that they looked like contraceptives.
Yeah, but that's
what did you think of that?
Yeah, but that's a classic one. I mean, remember when he used to talk about the coloured revolutions, and he you know, he made all these homophobic jokes, really, about the fact that he doesn't care what colour even if they're blue or whatever. You know, the point is that he's just, it's just very, very, it's just a classic Putin. He's kind of getting pally with the street talk, really. Yes, it's probably a standard joke, but he might regret saying these sort of things.
I think it shows the level of misunderstanding between the Kremlin and the streets at the moment. I mean, really, not all the people standing on those streets want to change the political system in Russia completely. And he could have reached out to some of them, you know, saying, I do understand the worries you have. I do understand your worries about corruption. I'm going to act. You know, we can do something with the election observation. We can do something with electoral laws and so on. Now that really happened. He is on defensive.
Dmitry, Asha started talking about Putin's reference to the colour revolutions. I mean, he's recalling Ukraine's pro-Western Orange Revolution of 2004. And what he says, he describes them as a well-tried method to destabilise society. You know, there's the implication that protesters are under orders from these Western meddling hands. Do you buy that?
You know, that's comparison with Ukraine isn't quite correct, because Ukraine is the country with two cultures, two nationalities, and there was the real fundamental contradictions between those two parts. And on 2004, there was the great play between the pro-Russian oriented part and the Western oriented part, Ukrainian part of Ukraine. In our country, you know, dear colleagues, I think that the majority of the meeting participants demanded against the boring politics of the previous years.